we would all appreciate it, particularly this year. Please remember there is a virtual audience. The event is being recorded and will be published on the library's YouTube. The link will be made available to those who have registered for the class and provided an email address. Those of you who are attending virtually may ask questions by posting in the chat box. We will be monitoring them. It is my pleasure to welcome our speakers today. The library has enjoyed many years of cooperative work with GMU. Wendi, Manuel-Scott and George Oberle are co-directors of the Center for Mason Legacies. The Center for Mason Legacies is an interdisciplinary and collaborative research center established by the University Libraries and the College of Humanities and Social Sciences. The center's mission is to preserve and examine the legacy of George Mason, the 4th, 1725-1792, his ancestors and heirs, and the people he enslaved. So welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
I'll try to give you a pass to get out.
Great. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks for coming. So we're gonna just jump right in. And we probably should note, we're also okay with you asking questions as we're talking. You don't have to like wait till we finish, so,
Yeah.
or comment, and it can be a much more conversational and engaging time together.
Yeah, great.
All right.
So this video actually has sound, but we didn't want to mess up our set. But in many ways, our work began with a project that was in, what was it, 2017, Wendi?
Yep, 2017.
It was called The Enslaved Children of George Mason. And we worked with 5 students, undergraduate students, who explored the history of George Mason as an enslaver. And that project resulted in a Omeka site with some different interesting types of work that were presented in this work. And what really spurred our president to get interested in this was our students' engagement with the topic. And so they went out, and you're seeing images of the day when we went out to Gunston Hall and looked for spaces and looked at different collections with various people at Gunston Hall to kind of better understand the enslaved people. And specifically, the thing that they really hung up on, Wendi, in a very positive way, was the idea of children, and Mason as an enslaver of children, which they saw examples of young adults who were not that different in age of themselves. And they wanted to know more and more about this, right? So that's really what we explored.
Yeah, and the only piece I'll add is for many of our students, the ones that were working on the project, but also for just the student body at large, they had very little knowledge about George Mason the Fourth, and most were and even are surprised to learn that he was an enslaver.
Right.
And so part of this research was to make that hidden, if you will, history legible for the entire university community.
Right. And we really, it was important to us also have a diverse group of students in terms of ethnic diversity, but also disciplinary diversity. We only had one history major in the group. The rest were from things like criminology. I remember Elizabeth did incredible work. And we had
global health.
Global health. I mean, it was a diverse set of disciplinary domains.
Yeah, and for us, the reason why that matters is these students were bringing not only their lived experience, but they were bringing questions to the research based on their disciplines. And so that enriched the project, I think, in a way that we probably didn't even fully anticipate, but we certainly encouraged it.
And it's funny, this was a moment, it was a very moving moment where we stood around and and acknowledged a number of enslaved people. And I still carry the card that I read. We were in a circle. And here's a card: Frederick, a man listed as not worth 1 farthing in 1792. And so it was really important to us to have, and this method that we designed, we didn't know we had a method in terms of our teaching yet, but over the course, and we'll talk about that in a minute, but the method that we designed was this idea of having critical care for people that we are studying, to not just re-traumatize and reproduce the trauma of the kind of harsh environment in which they were living, but also to acknowledge their humanity. Yes.
I have a question, because this is interesting. And if you're going to cover this in future, just tell me that. But was the enslaving children to keep families together, or to take children from their parents?
No, that's an excellent question. In many ways, it's hard to know, right, for sure. But it seems that the enslavement of children was actually part of the entire process.
Correct.
So when we do,
We're gonna
we'll
get to it,
a
yeah.
part where it specifically talks about how the wealth of individual enslavers were perpetuated, and that was through having children.
Yep.
So, yeah, so just we are here to also acknowledge George Mason's legacy. So George Mason's a well-known founder. He's probably best known for his Virginia Declaration of Rights, which was written in 1776. That became the basis, if you don't know, for the Declaration of Independence. And in fact, some would say Thomas Jefferson cribbed a lot of stuff from Mason. Mason was an incredibly good businessman. He tended to his own property and made a lot of money. Unlike many other founders, he did not die in debt. He actually had lots of money and land and enslaved people that were bequeathed to his many children. He's also well known for the objections to this Constitution of Government in 1787. And in that, Mason, who went to Philadelphia with the idea of having a stronger federal government, and he thought it was critical that a stronger federal government should exist. But after the conclusion of the convention, the Constitutional Convention in 1787, he actually had become disillusioned with significant parts of the actual Constitution. And significantly, the most important one that everybody talks about is there is no Bill of Rights. There's no statement of rights, which actually models his own needs and interests from the Declaration of Rights. So he wanted some kind of statement. And Virginia was not alone. In fact, about 8 other states at that time had some kind of Declaration of Rights as part of their state constitutions. But it should not be seen as he was just objecting to that. He had a laundry list of objections. He thought that we shouldn't have a Senate, we didn't need a vice president. I mean, he had a whole laundry list of things that he didn't like the way the trade was kind of, I mean, it's quite extensive what his problems were with the Constitution. And then he became a prominent objector to the Constitution being ratified and led that along with Patrick Henry in the Virginia ratification debates. Ultimately, because of this pressure, James Madison did write a Bill of Rights, and that became, well, the ones that were passed became the first 10 amendments to our Constitution.
Did he support that?
He was fine with that, but he was so Mason, I always say, was a cantankerous guy. I mean, very, very cranky, and very formidable in his legal arguments, and was known for that, and talked quite a lot about that. That's a great question. He still objected to a lot of other things. Move on. So Wendy, you want to talk
Yeah, I
about
can
that?
jump in here. So after summer of 2017, we worked with these 5 students. They presented their research to the rest of the Mason community. They had the opportunity to share their research with the president of the university, who was Angel Cabrera at the time. He was so impressed with the students that he asked them, he said, what would you like to see happen with all of this incredible research? And what you have to know is that throughout the summer, we would joke with the students saying, oh my gosh, one day, because of your research, you're gonna come back with your own children. And there'll be a little like plaque somewhere, acknowledging the enslaved people held by Mason. And so that was our big pipe dream. So when the president asked the students, they shared their dream with him. And he said, okay, well, we're in the middle of completely reimagining the center of our campus. So why don't you go and speak to the architects, the designers, and maybe there's something they can do. So 5 undergraduate students and 3 faculty members head off to talk to the project lead on the campus redesign. Oh, you can just get that. That's that, yeah. So that's perfect. So they were amazed, and so they agreed to sit down with us, and we started having regular meetings. Well, very quickly, it was clear that just a little plaque somewhere wasn't gonna do it. So we began to dream bigger. And just to give you a sense, so May of 2017, we conceive of this summer research project. The research happens in the summer of 2017. Students present their idea to the president in August, and then he gives the green light to go talk with the design team. By 2018, we've got a concept for a memorial now, not just a plaque, but a full-scale memorial. And then in 2022, right, as a part of George Mason University's 50th anniversary celebration, the memorial is dedicated, unveiled. That timeline is incredibly fast.
Yeah.
UVA, over a decade.
Yeah, they're just about to.
They just did, they
Yeah.
did, I don't know, a year and a half ago or something, right? And William and Mary, other institutions, this is usually a very prolonged, sometimes hotly contested project. We had the opportunity as faculty members to present the idea and the mock-up of the memorial to students, to the Board of Visitors, to faculty. We went to all the different constituencies across campus for months. And in the end, every single group that we spoke to offered unanimous support.
Right. And they gave us incredible feedback that you'll see in some of the
Right.
slides that we changed some ideas. But
now, I was gonna say, now the one question that came up very early in the process of the design of the memorial was, well, are you gonna take the George Mason statue down? So George Mason, as you now know, is basically 50 years old. And because of its youth, it doesn't have a lot of traditions. But the statue is very important in terms of our community culture. And there are also traditions surrounding the Mason statue. One being that when you arrive as a first-year student at Mason, you should rub his toe to have good luck and good fortune as a student, okay? And so we, as scholars, to the question about whether or not we were going to advocate for the memorial, for the Mason statue being removed, we said that what we were interested in as historians was complicating the history of Mason. And so it was not our intention to have the statue removed, but rather we wanted folks to have a much more complex, layered understanding of George Mason IV.
Yeah.
So
That begins with this base, right?
exactly. So the base initially of the Mason statue was just plain. With the memorial, and there are multiple kind of sites that are a part of the memorial, the base now includes 4 quotes from the writings of George Mason, some of which George has covered, but we'll go into a little bit more detail. One of the other additions was that when our students were working on their summer project, they worked very closely with the folks at Gunston Hall. They were in the archives, they were following leads, right, from the archivist and the archaeologist. And they learned that during one of the archaeological digs, brick was uncovered. And their assessment was that the brick was tossed aside because it was marred by a handprint. And so the individuals that created the bricks for the buildings and structures around the plantation were enslaved people. And so that imprint then is a shadow, right, of the enslaved person's hand on the brick. And so we decided that we would have that a 3D version of that brick created, and that it would be placed at the base of the statue. So now, rather than just having the image of Mason, the man and the table and the books next to him, we now have 4 quotes, and we have a brick that represents the handprint of individuals that he enslaved.
Okay, so yeah, and I was the one who's ended up selecting
The 4 quotes.
the 4 quotes, but I actually worked with several of my colleagues, in addition, Wendi, Ben, but also Rosemary Zagari and Cindy Kerner. And I basically, I selected these because, or we selected these collectively because they represented the 4 sides of Mason, the 4 Masons in one idea. And so we wanted to acknowledge George Mason. I said he was cantankerous, right? We wanted to acknowledge the good day he had when he wrote the Declaration of Rights, right? And then also the well-known idea of his objections to the Constitution, to kind of show a little bit of that cantankerousness, but also his letter to his son, which gave advice that in many ways was essentially follow your own path. Don't, you know, I always say in shorthand, I won't be able to say it much longer, but it's Frank Sinatra moment, right? So I did it my way, right? That's what he wrote to John Mason, one of his younger sons. But the thing that was really critical from our perspective was to add this other component in order to show the layered history of George Mason that Wendy's talking about, is his true statements about how he felt about slavery. The most clear statements, because it's controversial. Some people claim George Mason was against slavery, right? And he does make some statements about his opposition to things like the transatlantic slave trade. However, George Mason never freed, as far as we know, never freed a single enslaved person. And his statement, the clearest statement about how he felt about enslaved people, is in his last will and testament, written in 1773 and never changed, even when he died in 1792, although there is an update that actually I could talk about later if you have questions, in the form of a prenuptial agreement in 1789. But here he says, I give and bequeath unto my 4 daughters, Anne Mason, Sarah Mason, Mary Mason, Elizabeth Mason, and to each of their heirs forever,
So that's the first cue, right?
For each of their heirs forever.
Forever. So there is no insinuation that maybe these individuals should be emancipated,
Nope.
right?
No, unlike some other Virginians, right,
Right.
who did make those.
Yep.
The following slaves with their increase, and this is going to that point of
Yes.
how are they being valued?
Mhm.
And, you know, so a more kind of generous idea of some of the people who say George Mason was anti-slavery through his opposition to the transatlantic slave trade would say, well, he's opposed to it. He says he's opposed to it. However, a more cynical view might say, well, of course he's opposed to it. He's got his, and supply and demand means that's going to raise the value of his existing existing enslaved people. So I really think it's important to kind of look at a more layered kind of understanding of this issue. And it goes on, and I confirm a girl named Penny, and Penny's really important because we incorporated Penny into the rest of our memorial.
And so the last will and testament really becomes foundational to how we design and conceive of the memorial. But we've highlighted with their increase because what this tells us is that Mason understood that if he bequeathed women and young girls to his daughters, that the wombs of those young girls and those women would produce generational wealth.
Right.
Right? So the actual bodies of women, enslaved women and girls becomes the financial security for his daughters.
That's absolutely right. Yeah.
Again, I mean, to me, at least the families were held together, matriarchal families. Well, how were the fathers treated in this kind of thing? I mean, were marriages recognized
So
or not?
it's hard to say. In some cases, they are recognized by certain planners. We don't know.
But not
a lot.
legal. So
But they're not legal,
relationships
right.
could be recognized.
And what we do know from Mason's will, it's not on this stuff, but we do know that each of the sons received at least one male and one female. We don't know if they were actually married, but then you can infer
Mhm.
what that implies, which is that they were produced.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Each of Mason's sons?
each of Mason's sons
He had sons.
received at
Four
least,
daughters and
and 5 sons. Yeah. And so most of the enslaved people went to his oldest son, but each of the other sons they received other kinds of wealth, right? But they received at least one male and one female. Yes.
The names that were shown on the movie there and the ages, was that from the inventory in 1792?
Yes.
Yeah, it's from the will. So unfortunately, one of the things that's really irritating is that there was no inventory in 1792. So they did, who knows why they didn't do an inventory of Mason's estate in 1792, but they didn't. They did do an inventory of his sons, George Mason V, when he died in 1798-ish. And also his other sons, Thomas and Thompson, but those were a little later. So we can maybe find things, that match up through those inventories. Hope that answers.
So this is just a photo as we are trying to look at different potential text, which one will look best on display. So in the will, a girl named Penny is mentioned. And we'll show you more, but this just gives you a sense of the design process. We relied a lot on research from Mount Vernon. We work with some of those folks because they've had a substantial amount of funding to do research, and they actually have an exhibit at Mount Vernon on the lives of enslaved people. So that they were very, very helpful in this process for us. And so we decided that what we would create are these silhouette panels. One silhouette panel would be of Penny, mentioned in the will, a young girl. I'll tell you more about her in a moment. And then the second silhouette panel would be of James, an enslaved man. So that one is representing the children enslaved, and the other panel is representing the adults enslaved. But working with the designers and the artists, we then had to figure out what silhouette image was going to be most appropriate. I'll draw your attention to the James panel because this one was really quite interesting. So you see the first, we said, he's standing up a little bit too direct. He seems a little bit too slight of frame. That didn't seem quite right. We didn't like the direction of the quill so much. We were also trying to capture James' hair. James was Mason's manservant, so he was usually well appointed in terms of his attire, because when any guest came to Gunston Hall, it would have been, or often James would have opened the door. So he was a representation of George Mason of the Mason family. This third one here, 1, 2, 3, his head seemed to be bowed a little bit too much, not showing a sense of self. And we wanted to imbue James with a sense of authorship, although he was an enslaved man. And so in the end, this is the silhouette that we ended up selecting for James. You'll note his hand behind his back. That's intentional. We have a couple slides about this later, but the intention there was to indicate not only that he was an author of his own life, but that although we don't have documented evidence of this, that he might have resisted, perhaps in small ways, right? Virtually, maybe almost invisible ways he might have resisted. Maybe one afternoon, Mason was calling for him and he moved slowly, right? Now, we don't know that specifically about James, but we have examples of slow working from other accounts, from other records. And so we pull all of that in to inform the way in which we depicted James in the panel.
And I would add that some of these changes were made after engagement with scholars such as Spencer Crew, who was a director of the African American History Museum in DC, and others who kind of suggested, well, you're not imbuing James with any kind of agency. And so we thought carefully, what does agency mean, right? And we did all of our work on this entire project was engaging or asking questions and engaging sets of sources that might help
us understand.
Because in terms of James's life, we have about maybe 5 lines of text that survive, besides like looking at will or those kinds of documents, about 5 lines of text that survive from John, the son, who did a piece called The Recollections of John Mason, about his father, essentially. And he does describe some things that we now know about James, such as he was a father, he had a family in a place called Logtown, which was nearby. So we know some things about James. We also know what kinds of jobs manservants would do. And those would range, right? But they include like taking care of all the bodily needs of a person. But they also would have been privy to conversations. And any of you who have been to Williamsburg, you've seen some of the reenactors who kind of show what being privy to these conversations when people are talking about rights. And he's talking about universal rights in the way that they wrote, right? They write about universal rights, and then when you kind of pinpoint some things, then they say, well, we don't mean rights for everybody. But folks like James heard universal rights.
So,
Next page.
yeah, next page.
All right.
Just
So
another
this is
example,
just
like
another-
literally in the room, and you can see some of the other photos that
Yeah.
we're working with. So this big conference room, the walls are covered and we're going back and forth, we're having conversations to, make a decision about what's gonna be, what's gonna be
And
appropriate.
is that Kathy there?
That's Kathy down
Yeah.
there, yeah.
So, and she was one of our biggest advocates. She was the project manager.
And normally she's deciding what do faculty want in the classroom. Do they want the swivel chairs that be green or blue? And all of a sudden she found herself working with this and all in. The folks
Amazing.
that decided, they were all in, even the architecture team, which is out of Atlanta, Perkins and Will. They tend to do much more kind of straightforward designs for, large corporate campuses, that type of thing. And so when we added the memorial to their list of tasks to complete, they were like, oh, we don't have all the right people on the team. So they went and pulled people off of other teams to put them on the team with us. It was amazing. And actually, I think they won several awards for their work.
Yeah.
And they've been able to use that in some other projects.
Yeah, absolutely.
So
This is.
I mentioned Penny, and you saw Penny was one of the individuals given to Mason's daughter. So let's see, where should we start? So Penny, you'll see she's carrying a tea set, which George, we went down some rabbit holes to determine what the tea set should look like.
But we use Mount Vernon.
We use Mount Vernon. There is a bit of text on the left that gives folks a sense of who Penny was. She was an enslaved child at grandfather Albeck's plantation in Maryland. And so she was taken from that plantation in Maryland at the age of 10, sent to Gunston Hall, where she was then the enslaved servant of Mason's 10-year-old daughter, Anne, who, as far as we can tell, Penny was enslaved and served her the entirety.
Her entire life.
Her entire life.
And so when Anne got married in 1789
Penny
to a
followed.
man named Ronaldo Johnson, who lived in Maryland, she went to Maryland, different part of Maryland, and to live with Ronaldo Johnson and Anne.
Right. So a little bit of historical text on the side for folks. And then on both sides of the panel, we have the names of the enslaved children identified in the will. Okay. Now, the silhouette, we wanted to bring people into the world of Penny. So if you've ever been to Gunston Hall, which is not that dissimilar from Mount Vernon, when you walk in the front door, what do you see right in front of you? This big, expansive staircase. That staircase was for the Mason family and for white visitors. That staircase was not a space that Black enslaved people could inhabit. So the question then is, well, how the heck did they get up and down the stairs to help the family? Well, there was a service staircase. So when you walk in the front door and a couple steps and then you make a left and then you immediately turn left again, there is a narrow winding staircase that enslaved people used when they were in their duties, right, for the family. So this staircase is the space that young 10-year-old Penny would have taken multiple times a day while caring for little Anne. So what we decided to do in the design of the silhouette is that look at Penny's feet. Penny is climbing those stairs, right? 10-year-old little girl holding this tea set. But remember we said when we were working with the design of the James silhouette, we wanted to imbue him with agency, with a sense of authorship. We wanted to do the same with Penny. And so it's hard to see here, but her hand is up, right? So whether her hand is up to balance herself in that narrow hallway, whether her hand is up because somebody said something to her and she was like, "Dang, getting on my last nerve," right? That sense of self, right? We did not want to strip Penny of. And this is what emerges for us and really becomes central to our methodology and also our pedagogy, our teaching style, which is to be very mindful, yes, about the humanity of oppressed people, to make sure that we don't render them victims. And as George noted, to take great care. Now, this is something that in certain corners of the academic world, particularly for historians, we imagine our research efforts as being scientific, as being neutral, and you leave all of your heart, your spirit, your humanity as a scholar at the door. And so we said, no, right? How can I tell her story? How can I, as a mother, tell her story if I leave my heart at the door?
Right. I mean, we are still guided by evidence.
Yes.
Right. But we know that there is a whole kind of myth that people tell themselves that they are being neutral in their engagement with sources. And our whole point is that that's just false.
Yep.
Because the sources themselves were constructed in a manner in which they were not neutral to begin with.
Right. And the
George
way
Mason's will
is right, it's not neutral.
It's not a neutral statement.
No. And then the questions that we ask of the document are not neutral. The questions that I might ask, right? We've been working together a long time, so the questions we ask will probably be the same. But imagine, right? The questions that George might ask of a document and the questions that I might ask are going to be different.
They are different.
Right?
And that's because we bring different things to the
Yeah.
table. And that's not bad.
No,
And that's not false.
no, it's enriching, actually.
Right.
Right.
We have a more complete history in knowing that I'm a historian that focuses a lot on what historians call intellectual history, right? On history of ideas, big thoughts, right? However, that thought is very much better informed by cultural historians, by social historians, by people who ask different questions and use different methods. And that makes our work better. And it's not supplanting one view or another, it's adding.
Right, that's where we get to the complexity and the
There's
richness.
a question, yes.
Yes, there's a couple questions from
course.
our online groups.
Yep.
First one is, how did George Mason obtain his slaves? Did he purchase them or inherit them, or a combination of both? And then the second one is, did Mason make any attempt to educate, sorry, I gotta scroll it down, educate the enslaved children?
Good questions. So in terms of how did George Mason acquire his enslaved people, there is little direct evidence that he purchased them through the transatlantic slave trade. It is most likely that he did inherit many, and likely those inherited enslaved people increased in the manner that we're talking about earlier. I will say that the caveat, and we don't know, but his brother, Thompson Mason, who was based here in Loudoun County, was a participant in the transatlantic slave trade. And he worked with his father-in-law and the Gildert family. The Gilderts were well-known Liverpool slavers who they did actually have at least one ship called the Upton that had close to 80 enslaved people. And Thompson was responsible for making the sale possible on the Maryland shores, ironically, because, and I can give you more on this some other time, but on the Maryland shore, they did it in Maryland because there was no taxes on bringing in the enslaved people, whereas Virginia, as a colony, and this is in the colony 1760-ish, Virginia started to tax newly brought in enslaved people. So that's a long-winded answer.
And some of the Masons were ferrying, so we've got
That's
ferry
exactly
here in
right.
Loudoun, and what we now call Roosevelt Island
Yes,
was Mason Island,
Mason Island,
and they had a property,
They
a
had
plantation there.
big plantation there.
Yeah,
And Mason also had a ferry that crossed the Potomac up in the Woodbridge area, in that area. The second question was education. We really don't know.
yeah.
I honestly, I would only be speculating.
Yeah, we have no evidence that he
There
did.
is absolutely no evidence one way or the other.
Yeah.
And then there's one more
Sure.
that came in. Is there any evidence that George Mason or another Mason fathered children with an enslaved woman?
That is always the question.
That's always a good question. No.
We don't know.
We have no evidence
Yep.
one way or the other.
Yep.
We do know that James was described by John Mason as mulatto, as were other enslaved people, meaning there was some kind of interracial relationships that happened somewhere along the road
Yeah.
in the various properties of George Mason.
Yeah.
But we don't know specifics.
Yep.
This isn't a Sally Hemings
Yeah.
kind of story where we do have pretty good evidence.
Yeah, and there was a fire, which also has
Yes.
deviled us and made it
Yeah.
difficult. So we don't have the robust kind of documentation that we have for other founding fathers.
But we are still working, and we're trying to kind of, we're building a data set of enslaved Mason families through different generations. Trying to at least go up to the Civil War. I think Casey had a
Yeah.
question.
Hey, Casey.
Hi. Did the Gilders own the Upton?
The Gilderts, I believe, own the Upton.
And you said Thompson Mason was out here in Loudoun. Do you know, is there a lot of documentation on the routes that the enslaved who were landing in, was it Annapolis? Was it farther west?
So it was in the area right adjacent to Stafford County. And it was kind of, I think they talked in the newspaper advertisement about Boyd's Hole as a place where they were doing some business. It was in the newspaper ad, they specifically say that we will provide boats to cross the river. So if you want to come from Virginia, you can come. So it was very, it was intentional. Yeah, so, and they had a few different days that they did it. It was quite a large number, and the best people to look at if you want to see some of this history is Tobacco and Slaves.
Oh, yeah, name is escaping me too.
The name, it's
It's okay.
yeah, it's
Same.
Kukalov.
Yeah.
Kukalov.
How many slaves would he have at any one time?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the best evidence we have of that comes from the 1780 tax information that is just kind of taken every year. And that's a hodgepodge of stuff. And by that time, he's already distributed some of his enslaved people to the family, right? So you have to kind of, in those numbers at that period, he's in the 30s and 40s. It has been estimated that he had probably over 300 over the course of his life, and a 100-ish max,
And that
at one
includes
time.
kids too, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
But those are really hard to determine. Like, I don't know where those people really came up with those numbers.
But
to be
that
honest.
still made him one of the largest slaveholders.
Yeah, so there's a really great, it's an old article by Jackson Turner Maine, great social historian of the 50s, called The 100, that it shows George Mason is right there right in the middle of the top 100 people of enslaved people.
How's that compared to Jefferson?
Jefferson, different times, but Jefferson had more enslaved people. The nearest comparable person to Mason, certainly in Fairfax, is Washington, and Washington had about 3 for every 1 of Mason. Now, that also means, that he's got his wife's slaves, so. Yeah.
How many plantations or properties did Mason have and where?
Oh, gosh, a lot. So he had, and don't quote me on this, right? Because I always have to look this up, but it's about 5 different properties. And they were in Virginia, Maryland, and in various parts of Virginia. The thing that's really, those are his plantations, but Mason also had tons of land out in, the Ohio River Valley. If you follow the 7 Years' War and all that stuff, he and Washington and all of them are really committed to westward expansion because they have so much land and, west of the Appalachia. So Kentucky, he has a lot of land in Kentucky and in that area. So he's got a lot of land.
Speculator.
In fact, he had so much land that the land wasn't worth as much in some ways as the enslaved people. But you really have to see them together. It's almost like having a modern 401k, right? That you have different asset classes. And so, yeah, I hope that answers.
Did you get enslaved on the other properties as well, or only on Gunston?
He did have enslaved people on properties, I think there's the Maryland one might have been called Matawan Woman property, and I can't remember all the names of them, but yeah, he does have enslaved people there. And he talks about the specific properties in great detail in his will.
Good.
Yes, another question.
I just have a question. How far down into the history did any of this property stay within the Mason family?
Yeah, that's a great question.
Mhm.
So essentially, much of the Mason property, they start to lose it by the 2nd generation after George Mason IV. And then the remainder of that property is absolutely gone for the most part by the end of the Civil War. So James Murray Mason kind of holds on to some property. I think Selma might have been one of his plantations out in Winchester area, or it's right around here. Yeah. And then, of course, he's like a fire eater, starting all kinds of stuff in the Civil War. So he definitely loses a lot of his property for lots of reasons. And then John Mason, who I know quite a bit, my students have done a lot of work on Mason Island. And so John Mason, he was really into a lot of different kinds of business endeavors, but he lost the Mason Island.
The house burned down.
And the house ended up burning down. It's hard to know why, but he lost that by the certainly by 1750s. So they lost, yeah. So 1740s, I should say, because he dies.
Casey, is there another question?
Okay.
Okay, all good. Okay, that's good. I can show you here.
Yeah.
So you can see, or go back one second.
Go back one, yeah.
Yeah, so you can see that the silhouette has a very sharp kind of cutout that allows us to see the Mason statue. So this was also developed, we cooked this up in the room, that, again, we wanted folks to interact with Penny and James, to place themselves again in their world. And so, yeah, you can go over now. So with the penny panel, we have a marker in the ground. I think it's on the next slide, I'll show you in a moment. And either someone who is a child or someone in a wheelchair. So what is that, 49 inches? Okay. Looking through the penny panel, we'll see George Mason. Okay. So normally when we think about enslaved people, we understand that they were always being watched, evaluated for their labor, the quality of their labor. And so here what we want to do, again, is to kind of complicate how we're thinking about the past, provide an opportunity, again, to think about the agency that Penny may have been able to use. And so what folks now, by standing on that marker, they are looking at George Mason. They are in the position of being an enslaved person who is looking back at the individual who holds them in lifelong, inheritable bondage, right? So we're shifting the power. Her gaze, right, is now our gaze. Rather than looking at Penny from the perspective of being a slaveholder, we have Penny looking at Mason as the enslaved. And so you see the marker up here, and it prompts folks, consider how slavery and freedom coexisted in America. And because we're thinking colonial era, we have barefoot prints on that marker. For the James marker, we have something more shoe-like with another prompt, consider how our rights have changed since Mason's time. So at this point, you're getting a sense of all of these different kind of moments and sites that are embedded into the memorial that give the visitor an opportunity to engage, take active engagement with the memorial. It's not a passive experience. So whether they're walking around the statue, looking at the four excerpted quote, whether they are putting their hand in the very imprint of the tossed aside brick, whether they are looking at the penny panel, perhaps putting a piece of paper and taking a rubbing from one of the enslaved children's names, right? Whether they are imagining Penny going up that narrow winding staircase, multiple moments to imagine the world of the enslaved with care. And then with the James panel, again, there's a marker, but when you look through the silhouette, through James' eyes, Mason is not this larger than life figure, but rather he is a wee bit tinier, right? Perhaps that's because James was a man, right? Perhaps that's because James often had to, we believe, carry Mason because Mason had several ailments and was infirmed. And so might that have changed their dynamic in some way? Perhaps because James, upon occasion, had to bring Mason his ink and quill because it was too painful for Mason to walk about, right? Maybe many reasons why the James gaze on Mason is different than Penny's gaze. So one of the other important factors is that we know enslaved people ran away from their slave holders. Countless books have been written on that. But we were so fortunate as to discover two slave advertisements published by Mason and his son, in search of, enslaved individuals who took flight from Gunston Hall. So one from published in the first one, 1784 on the right side, and then a second, in 1786. The one, I'll turn your attention to the one on the right from 1784. 10 pounds reward, ran away from the subscriber, that's Mason, about 6 weeks ago. 2 slaves, Dick, a stout, lusty mulatto fellow, about 22 years of age, large features and eyes, a very roguish down look, beats a drum pretty well. Now this stopped us in our tracks. Our other colleague is an Africanist. And so it gave us an opportunity to think about the way in which enslaved people held on to their African cultural practices, right? And also created new African American cultural practices, right? Music being one way in which they might have expressed their culture. And then is artful and plausible, which might mean he was quite bright, observant, using his observations to make stealthy decisions. And well acquainted in most parts of Virginia and Maryland, having formerly waited upon me. So we don't have any evidence that James ran away from Gunston Hall, but this ad does provide evidence that other individuals that waited on Mason used the insight, right, from serving Mason. When Mason left, they would have been traveling with him, looking at the landscape, creating a mental map, and then later utilizing that. So we're pulling, again, as George noted, from other documentary evidence to think about who James was and how he might have, what we say as a kind of form of shorthand, engaged in freedom dreaming. Yeah.
Same guy, okay?
Yes. Yes,
Yes.
that's great observation.
Yes.
And
He ran away twice.
he ran away.
First time
twice.
recaptured.
But the second time, we think, not just us, other scholar who has done this work, thinks he's got away.
He got away.
And he ended up spending his life as a boatman.
Yep.
Doing work on the Potomac.
Yep. Yep. And there's an indication because Mason says, where does he say that he? Yep. And we do have evidence of that. I forget now what he changed his name to. Yep. When he was caught, he said, "Oh no, I'm a free man."
That's right.
And you got the wrong person. Yeah.
Maybe he forged them. Maybe he got it somehow. Yeah.
Oh yes, even this one, it says, I suspect they have made their way towards Baltimore, Philadelphia.
It would suggest that they were educated.
It could. I agree.
Going back to the question.
They could have been.
Could
have picked up things along the way.
Yeah, or, so there is a wonderful book, about an enslaved person named Ona Judge, owned by the Washingtons. And they regularly traveled back and forth between Virginia and Philadelphia. And the Washingtons understood that you couldn't have an enslaved person for up to, was it 6 months?
Yeah, it was something either 6 months or a year, I can't remember.
In Philadelphia, or they could make a claim for being a free person.
Yeah.
So they would they rotate their enslaved people in and out, right? And one of those individuals was Ona Judge. And Ona Judge eventually escapes, and they spend years trying to recapture her unsuccessfully. But Ona was able to reach out to the free Black people and other enslaved people in Philadelphia to help her take flight, to help her run away from the Washingtons. I mentioned that to say these individuals could have had some writing, reading skills, or they could have accessed the resources or literacy of other individuals to help them run away.
And Baltimore and Philadelphia is really important because there's large numbers of
Free
free
black,
blacks.
that's right.
In those places.
Yep.
And it's interesting that both times, and these are two men running away together, right?
And the age,
and
which
their
was
age,
pretty
yeah.
common. There have been several studies kind of look at what are the kind of common characteristics of enslaved people who ran away. And young men, early 20s, they were the most likely individuals who ran away.
It's also really critical, and to bring it back to how we help our students think about this. Wendi was spending a lot of time talking about the physical description that is here in the advertisement, because these advertisements are just laden with physical descriptions of these people, partly because they want to recapture their property, right? There's an obvious thing. But the unintended consequence of that is, one, we learn more about the enslaved person. Perhaps they are skilled at beating the drum, right? As one thing. Perhaps they are artful
Right,
and
artful and plausible.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
But we also learned something about the enslavers as well, because they say things like roguish down look,
Yeah.
right? Lusty fellow,
Yeah.
right? I mean, there's stuff that helps us. And the physical clothing in the other ad, where there's,
Clothes,
light lead colored.
short green.
Yep.
Yeah.
So all of that is really, what we try to help our students understand is you have to extract as much out of these to understand the mindset and to understand the questions that just are not going to be produced because James or Dick or Watt or Clem didn't leave behind other kinds of evidence.
But if you were to read this from the perspective of an enslaver, then it's like, oh, he's plausible, he's artful, like those become negative characteristics. He's tricky, right? But if we inhabit a Black gaze, a Black perspective, then what again does plausible and artful mean?
That's different.
That's much different.
So this is all very important. So this is just the same thing we just talked about.
Question.
Yeah, sure.
It says Dick is a mulatto. Are there
Yes.
records that show how he came to be enslaved by George Mason? Was he born on Mason's plantation?
No, we don't know. What we do know is that Dick shows up very young in the 1773 will of George Mason. That's all I know. I didn't see anything. So George Mason's mother died in 1765, I believe, and there was an inventory of her property. I don't remember seeing Dick there. So he shows up, then he shows up here, and then it's gone. Okay.
So that's not the end of the memorial.
I know, there's still.
So the initial plan was that there was going to be this fountain, and that was it, right? And then we came in and just blew it all up. So one addition was to add a quote by one of our former faculty members, Roger Wilkins, which is in the quote. But the main kind of addition to the fountain has to do with the base of the fountain itself. So normally they just would have, I guess, poured cement in the base, and that would have been that. Well, again, thinking about how do we critically care for enslaved people? How do we show that we care? When our students were working with the archivists and the archaeologists at Gunston Hall, they were informed of, again, several digs, one which located the brick, but some of the other findings included a pit. And it's believed that that pit would have been located under a cabin where enslaved people lived, not too far from the Gunston, from the main house. And this was a common practice among enslaved people in at other sites. And it would include rocks, shells, maybe shards of wood, and they're laid out in a cylindrical fashion. And that is incredibly important because, again, relying on other primary sources, but also secondary sources, research by other scholars, particularly in studying other places throughout Virginia, we know that laying out of stones and other natural elements in this circular fashion was tied to enslaved people's African religious and cultural beliefs. So we begin to think about, what did it mean? Yes, to be enslaved, to experience violence, forced labor, and at the same time, eke out minutes and hours with your community to worship as you choose, to weep, to honor those who have passed on, right? And to do so in a way that's culturally rich for you. And so what we decided was that they would find these, what do they call them?
They're like river stones.
River stones. They would cut them in half, and then they would lay them out in this cylindrical fashions pattern to replicate the archaeological find.
And it's really beautiful with the water.
Mhm.
I can imagine. There was no indication of what was on top of these circular areas.
So they were called pits, and they were often hidden
Mhm.
from the gaze of the enslaver.
Mhm.
So they were
In the
in the
cabin,
cabin.
like, and then hidden somewhere underneath where they could.
And this is coming from archaeologists.
Mhm.
not us.
Right.
Mhm. Yeah. We had a chance to talk to the gentleman,
Oh, yeah.
and we told them why, and they were just kind of in awe, and they said, yeah, they never get to do this. Usually you pour the
Yeah.
stuff in, you make sure it's flat and smooth, and you move on. So they were, I actually got a little bit emotional understanding why they were doing it.
Yeah, it was really amazing. Casey?
Was there any particular, were there particular stones that were usually used, particular materials, or was it really like geographically dependent where you were? Was it more, I guess what I'm trying to ask is, was it more important that the patterns were there rather than the materials that were used to create the pattern, or were the materials just as integral as the pattern?
So I'm relying my understanding on other people's scholarship. And it's partially geographically based, but I've seen over and over cowrie shells
Cowrie shells are,
really critical in all of these.
well, right, and they come from the Atlantic slave trade, and cowrie shells they're from the Maldives, from
Yeah.
the Pacific
Yeah,
ocean area. And they were used as money. And so European traders would bring these big bags, stacks of cowrie shells, and they had calculations for how many. And it was a statement of wealth. So there's a lot of kind of history and connection in terms of cowrie shells and African people. So, and there's been evidence of enslaved, captive Africans, enslaved people in the Americas having shells on them.
right.
In the Americas. So that is part of it. And then we also learned that some of the rocks that were included in that pattern are from the Potomac river area. Yeah.
Which would make sense because it's right there.
And so and we have evidence that they would have gone down to do some fishing for
Right.
example,
No, they definitely, and in fact, in their time off, they often
fish and hunt.
fished for themselves
Mhm.
and got is it the shad fishing?
Yeah,
Shad
yeah,
fish,
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
which is an oily fish. Anyway, yeah,
And so, when we began to, go to the different constituencies and present, the idea of the memorial, and we got wonderful feedback. One morning, Kathy Wolf-Pinsky, who was the project manager, who was like all in, one morning, she was just walking the campus. No memorial is up yet, right? We've just been talking to the community about it. And she sees what seems to be a piece of paper over near the original George Mason statue. Because it's Kathy, she's like, oh, we can't have litter on campus. And so she goes over to pick up this piece of paper. And then she looks at it. And this was at the toe of Mason, the toe that our current tradition is you rub the toe for good luck. Instead, this torn piece of paper was there. Dear George, I will take the degree education you did not want Penny to have.
which blew us away.
Yeah.
So,
Got it.
Yeah.
yeah, and just to be clear about the statue also, if you've ever been on our campus when they're doing some kind of
Oh, yeah,
celebration,
that's the other piece.
I mean, George Mason, I hate this. Like during Pride Week, they have these wonderful kinds of capes and things.
We had
all
some
kinds of-
PETA students put burger,
Yes,
like
hamburger.
fresh burger meat all over it.
Yeah, yeah,
And they're allowed to, so you can go make a request and you get the statue for a week. You can do whatever you want on the statue, nothing permanent,
right.
but you can, whatever, whatever holiday it is, it doesn't matter, whatever we want to celebrate.
The library, which I work for, we did an
Can
open access week, so.
Decorate them,
Open
yes.
access.
So, yeah, the statue, as we were kind of saying earlier, is very much a part of the campus culture.
Yeah.
All right, so
Okay,
you can't see the Mason statue. It's further down to the left.
Yeah.
But you can see the penny, what we call the penny panel right there.
There's a.
Oh, yes.
Oh, okay, so there's Penny,
Statues over
yeah,
there.
statues over there. So that's Penny. You can see the marker right over there, the marker on the ground where you would stand so you could look through. And this is the fountain, and then James is over here. All right, so the expansiveness of this memorial and the many kind of touch sites makes it very different. Than other memorials, not to say it's better, just different. Most are kind of like one feature and you go to that one feature.
And it's in the middle of the campus.
And this is in the middle of
It's not
campus.
hidden.
No,
It's not hidden.
no, you have to kind of pass it all the time. And then they also ended up creating this labyrinth with
Oh,
this
this is
big old
great.
stone, like a contemplative moment, spiral as well.
Yeah,
Yes.
and then we do have two interpretive panels.
Yeah, one's there, the other
One's
one's
off.
past James. Yeah, so this is if you come to campus now, this is what you will encounter. And the other thing we wanted to make sure is that one day you might begin the memorial from the vantage point of James and you'll have one experience. Another time you could begin it from Penny's.
It's
And
different.
the memorial, each time you pass it, we want it to unfold for you.
And we truly want the fountain to be in the center as a contemplative place,
Right.
right? Someplace, it's actually my favorite place to just sit
Yeah.
on campus.
And if you've ever been to the African American Historical History Museum, at the end of that, there is the big water feature, right? I mean, it's a heavy journey, right? If you've experienced the museum. And if you've ever been to the Holocaust Museum, similarly, there's this everlasting flame, right? Again, this space to kind of hold your heart after having taken this journey through, either of those museums. And so that was also in our mind in terms of kind of thinking about the significance of this water feature in the middle and that you could walk through it to this other space.
Are those two water features or does the water go under the?
It goes underneath, so they're interconnected.
Mhm.
And when we did the dedication
Yes.
in 2022, our dear colleague and co-director of our center, Gabi Tayak and Wendi went down to the Potomac and they
Mhm.
gathered up water from the Potomac. And Gabi, who is an indigenous person, who is a member of the Pamunkey tribe, I believe, in Maryland.
Yep, we did a ceremony, the two of
We
us.
did a ceremony. It
Well, we
was-
collected the water, it was
Yeah.
a ceremony, the two of us.
And then.
And then we brought that water and
It was, and they poured it into
the student
The-
and students and faculty members of indigenous heritage,
It
they
was
poured the
incredible.
waters of the Potomac
it was very moving.
into the fountain and offered up,
To sage,
yeah.
burned sage, they
Mhm.
did, and there was tobacco there as a
Mhm.
gift, whatever, I'm not
Yes,
really great with the ritual specifics, but
but,
we
and
were
we-
very honored to have her participate. in
and
that.
we co-crafted some language about the significance of water
Yes.
in the histories and cultures of people of African descent and indigenous people. And so it was also symbolic of binding our histories together. And that was a part of the narrative that we shared during the dedication.
So there's two questions. The first one I'll ask is, where's the memorial located on campus?
Sure. So it's right in the middle of the campus right near the Johnson Center. And
If you park
if you
at,
park at the Mason Pond Park, a deck,
Mhm.
which is expensive, sorry, it's not my fault.
it's the parking lot closest to the center of campus.
And it's right there, and
It's
it's
right
right
there.
there in the middle.
Yep.
And then the other question is from Bert Evans. She says, I have African-American family members who connect to the Masons in Loudoun County.
Oh, yeah.
John 1769, Mary Mason 1790, and others. And then she puts in parentheses, no census files. So are probably enslavers of my cousins' ancestors. I found in their ancestry trees, sorry, I have to scroll down. Some of these Masons married to the Fairfaxes. Would these be relations to George Mason of Gunston Hall?
They could be. I would love to talk more. Maybe you could put my email in.
We can.
Chat, and
Hi, Miss Gertrude.
would love to talk more to you, Mr. Gertrude. Yes.
So are going to be a DNA component of this?
Oh.
We don't have that.
We don't
money.
have that kind of money.
We are struggling to get a few dollars to pay
Just
some
to get some
researchers.
student-
Well,
And-
that would answer the
Yeah.
question.
No, that'd be interesting.
Yeah.
Casey, did you have something?
So is there any, and I'm sorry if I missed this, was there any, why was it placed in this location? Because like you and I discussed once how it runs parallel to the previous school street.
Mhm.
And now if you could have followed this pathway directly west, you would have, could have run into the, the other settlements that are now at the intersection of the Fairfax County Parkway.
Yeah.
And then farther west, you're in town, so was
No.
that intentional or was that?
It's the Mason statue.
It's the Mason statue and the serendipity of so do you see that big building?
Right, that was the other
behind,
piece.
For everybody, I know you know, but
It's big.
that building replaced our old Robinson Hall building.
Yeah.
And so.
Where the
The
garden
reason
area
they were
is.
doing all this center stuff is they had to do all this infrastructure work.
Right.
And so they were tearing it all up. And they had
Yeah.
no money, but so honestly, it was a small amount of money,
Mhm.
maybe $30,000. I mean, I don't know. And part of it was raised externally, like people give, people
Mhm.
gave some money for it. So they had money for a fountain. That's it.
Right, right. But they had lots of money for the whole
For the
redo.
big.
So
Right.
it was the stars aligned
Yes.
because while we did fundraising, some of this the cost was already built into the campus redo. And we had President Angel Cabrera at the time who was like, I'm all in.
Yeah.
We had, again, Board of Visitors, all the right folks said yes. And we began this process as a student-driven research project, not for more complicated reasons, which is also why I think we were able to move so quickly.
Yeah. Yeah, and we don't have the same direct legacy.
Right, and that too.
And tie to slavery that places like William and Mary.
Right, or UVA,
UVA,
actually built by enslaved.
That were actually built by the.
Right.
Or sold like
Right.
in Georgetown, right?
Yeah.
To kind of keep the institution open.
Right, yeah.
So, I mean, we have a different kind of legacy, which we're
Right.
gonna get to
Yep.
in a second.
Exactly.
That-
So
yeah.
as a result of that memorial project, I remember when we had the dedication, people were like, oh, y'all can rest now, you're done. And we were like,
No,
no.
You're not paying attention.
no, we're just getting started.
Right.
And so we created the Center for Mason Legacies, and we initiated what we call the Black Lives Next Door project. And it's got lots of different components. But key to the work that we do has to do with subversive history, complicating history, and always being mindful that the work that we're doing does not violate Black bodies, Black people, Black life, and instead takes extreme care when we are doing the research and when we are producing the work for the public. And we rely on lots of different scholarships. Some of my favorite or our favorite scholars, Stephanie Camp, who left us too soon, but her work continues to be just so impactful. Or Catherine McKittrick, who is a geographer, in fact. And one of the things we think about here is that Black lives, as you see here in the second bullet, are spatial stories, spatial histories. Now we're focusing on African-American lives, but this is true of all of us. Our lives are spatial, and we give or make meaning in space. We make certain spaces have meaning because of how we inhabit them. And so having that kind of framework informs the courses that we teach. It informs the memorial, right? Think about the staircase. And it is informing the ongoing research projects, of which we have many. We kind of mentioned this already, but we're thinking about how we can use documents in a subversive way. So while Mason's saying, oh, right, be wary, he's artful, this runaway, we're thinking, oh, how can we subvert that? How can we think about what it might have meant for an enslaved person to be artful, right? And then how can we recuperate their stories, huh?
Say that again.
Who did Dick become?
And who did
Yes,
Dick become?
exactly.
Exactly.
That's
And that is a whole thread that is like on our to-do list, yes. And so we've said to you this phrase kind of critical care. That's a shorter version of a fancier term or concept that we coined called effective historical practice. Effective means emotion, and praxis means both theory and action. So the work that we do is about how we bring that care with the historical research to the projects that we are engaged in throughout Northern Virginia. And I'll just read the last sentence here. So that we're empowering students to focus on affect, emotion, as a powerful transgressive tool that enables an ethical and justice-centered practice. We do this work not just when students write papers, they're not just writing a paper doing research so it can sit in our inbox. Right? We want it to have impact, right? And part of that impact is to make sure stories and histories that have far too long been silenced and erased are no longer silenced and erased, to make them legible and known for generations.
Yeah, so part of so the librarian in me is always focused on going beyond what people think librarians do. So librarians, they think that all that we do is help them find stuff, and that is incredibly important. The idea of finding is a core element of doing research. But it's also critical for librarians to be actively engaged in helping people learn how to use the information and then produce information. And so that is all kind of designed in the idea of bringing these theories that we've been talking about into action by engaging with different kinds of primary sources. So in the class that Wendi and I co-taught, one of the things that was really critical for us is making sure that students learned how to think geographically about stories of Black lives. So, and we took something that was very, very traumatic. Newspaper stories about lynchings, right? I mean, this is
In Virginia, Northern Virginia.
Northern Virginia area, broadly defined.
Yes.
We had to like extend it a little bit to like get, I think we went down to Orange County
Yeah.
or a few places like that. But nevertheless, because each student did their own geographical kinds of mapping of the life of a person whose life was interrupted
Yeah.
by this really horrible action. So we don't center, I mean, yes, we talk about the horrible action, but we talk about how did they get there,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So they started, in one case, the one that we showed.
Down in North Carolina, got on a
started in
train in North Carolina. Yep.
Got on a train, and we found out by interrogating the newspapers, many different newspapers,
Mhm.
more than just in one little collection or that or another, you had to look all around.
Mhm.
And what we found is that he was going up to West Virginia, Charleston, to have a job up there.
Mhm.
And
Got
he
pulled off,
got
chased
pulled
off.
off a train in a sundown town
Mhm.
and was chased and ultimately drowned in the river.
Yep.
Now, we don't just tell that story. We talk about the train, right? We talked about all the different kinds of things.
Students had to locate the river, and
Right.
then they looked to see what time of year it was, and that was a heavy rain season. So it said he was chased and drowned by. So, okay, and so
Fast current.
fast current, they were able to do all this, right? So more than just say this person died, by taking or using this kind of geographical awareness, they were able to actually flesh out a much richer history of this individual up until his last breath.
And even after it, because then we found out that because this made a big splash, right, in terms of news, and the governor office was getting involved. And in fact, we didn't go into the governor's records. There's
Yep.
more that could be done. But anyway, what we did, the family was welcomed to come up
Mhm.
to this town
They
in the
said, "No,
Shenandoah
thank you."
area to get the body, right? And they didn't say hell no, but they said hell no, they
Yeah.
didn't show up.
Yep. Yep,
Right.
yep. So these are type of things, I will run through because I see we're looking at the time. So
Yep.
this is like an example of the way in which we do this work. This is the point that we make over and over and over to our students that maps are evidence, but they're not neutral sources. Right, geography space is not neutral. Which assignment was this one? Can't remember.
So this is, oh, right, so you have the example of all these African-American sites
Oh,
in,
mhm.
so you have the churches, so all these purple sites were actually African-American sites. And if you click on them, there's a nice GIS description of what those sites were. And down here is that Mandy's?
I don't know. But
building?
what we ask students to do, you know, when you locate an individual, an African-American individual, what else can you find out about them? So if you know they lived in a particular time period, well, what Black church was there? Might they have gone to that Black church? What Black school was there? And so by thinking spatially, you can develop questions that help you enliven the history.
So,
Yeah,
right. So,
these
yeah,
are
this
other
is another one.
projects that we've got students working on, or they worked on in the past. You can go to our
So-
website.
Yeah, and this is an example, the one on the left is an example of using the annotate feature in Omeka that allows you to do call outs to describe what's happening in, this person did something on how textbooks refer to the Civil War. Especially in the South. And so, he does some annotation here. This one on the right was from a scrapbook of a Children of Confederacy group
In
in Fairfax.
1957.
And yeah, so this is just another way.
But this is the type of work that we have students submit.
This is an example of
Richard.
done by Tony Godone, who was one of our doctoral students and now is a professor down at Radford, who found a trust between Richard Chichester Mason and Alexander Hunter, in which he put up enslaved people that
Oh.
were based in
I was about
Mississippi.
to say, look down at the description, right? Mason's Virginia home enslaved people in Madison County, Mississippi, to secure a debt Mason owed to Hunter.
So what that implies is you can't just trust that they didn't have slaves, right? Anymore. They only had 5 slaves in Fairfax County. You can't just trust that because they actually have
Enslaved people.
enslaved people all through the county or country because they are moving west and using the value of their enslaved people to help them speculate on land to both buy more land and buy more enslaved people.
Yep, collateral.
Oh, and this is Shamika's work.
Yep, so we've had students, again, not just submit a traditional paper, but rather they were creating these Omeka sites. And in this case, one of our students was interested in enslaved girls and women who engaged in infanticide. And she wanted to understand why a mother might do that. And so she, again, taking critical care and looking at coroners' Inquisition records, which you can see how time-consuming that would be. She developed just a really powerful project, but she highlighted in one of the documents that in the account, it said that she used an instrument of death, the mother. Yes, there
So
you go.
what are instruments of death?
Yes.
So then she explored
What that
might mean.
Yep.
And so from the white perspective, the instrument of death was a tool to cause harm.
Right.
Right.
For the
But
mother,
this could have been
the
for
most
mother.
loving act she could have ever.
It could be.
Yeah. And then she mapped it. So you see some of the places that she where some of the individuals were.
That used these instruments of death.
Yep.
Right.
Yeah.
So then we tried to understand our early African-American student population at George Mason and where they all
Where they
lived.
lived, and so students mapped that.
And whoops, sorry. And then we have a bunch of other things.
So if you want, if
Welcome
you're
to
interested,
explore.
yeah, we've got all these different kind of projects going. For more about the Mason family in Loudon, the Mason family projects, George has had his students going through that, and it's very, very rich. Then we've got all these other kind of Black Lives Next Door projects, and students' work is displayed there.
And we have partnerships with the Balch Library for with a few different collections that have been annotated a bit.
And then I was really quickly, so we were
This
working.
is not our work, by the way,
No.
this one, but
But we will be working. with them
we
still.
will. Kristen's gonna be part of our team.
Yeah, but I added it here because what we are really interested in are the way in which racial covenants and other types of racially exclusive laws and prevented African Americans from purchasing property for living in certain neighborhoods. We are finishing up a very big project for Fairfax on that, but this is also a rich area of exploration in terms of Loudoun County too. So when we think about mapping erasure, we have the Willard community where Dulles Airport now sits. Balch holds some wonderful records that our students have been exploring, including Casey over there. And we find documents, these assessment documents that are they're amazing, with photos and then also a description of the value of the home, of the property. But what's really exciting for us is that we have actual photographs of African-American homes in Loudoun County before they were destroyed. Yeah, which I'll show you really quickly before we draw
Do what?
things. We're always mindful that when we do this work, we don't do this alone, and we are mindful that we do this by standing on the shoulders of folks that are the elders of the community, who have lived here a very long time, who have insisted on their stories not being forgotten. And so we always are appreciative of whatever contribution they're willing to make. In this case, Louis Jett, who was born in Willard, and we've had a chance to interview him, was incredibly generous with his own stories and documents that he has in his personal collection. All right, yep, and yeah.
Documents also aren't neutral.
Yep, nothing's neutral. So, you know, we might look at this is
Oh,
a
so have you
video.
seen this video?
It's
Oh,
not
God.
public accessible.
I was blown away.
Yeah,
with it.
so we have it. We will be incorporating it into a website about Willard soon. But it has like this Disney music behind it.
I mean, you remember those Disney productions of, you know,
Very happy.
things are getting better all the time. you
Yeah.
know, and stuff.
But you get, so this is 1958, and so go to the next one. This is the one that takes your breath away. So we showed you from the assessment videos, African-American homes. Well, the way in which the African-American homes and white homeowners' property was quickly destroyed was by setting it all aflame. And this is what's after,
And
right?
bulldozers there to like. move
Yeah.
them.
And so like it's Dulles.
Dulles.
To Bill Dulles. But that's full story we're working on. It hasn't been told, both in terms of the Black residents, but also the white residents.
So they weren't, wasn't like, was it eminent?
Yes,
domain or
basically,
Yeah, they
except
used-
they used condemnation. They condemned the land.
Yeah, and it was very poorly
something? Oh, I
compensated,
see.
very poorly.
Yep, yep.
In fact, that was some of the complaints from, we found this really a great example of a white woman who was labeled by these
As a
people
troublemaker.
Troublemaker, right?
She was getting people
Because she was
riled up.
getting people riled up saying, and what she actually sent as a document was that, look, we cannot afford, my husband and I work here, right? And we cannot afford to
Mhm.
actually be anywhere nearby where our work is, based on what you guys are gonna compensate us.
And there were congressional hearings.
Yeah.
About the poor compensation.
Still she persisted.
So she persisted.
Indeed.
Yes. So I think that's it
Yeah, I
right
think
there. So,
Leave some
yeah, we'll leave a little bit of time. I hope that was,
for questions.
okay, yeah.
Yeah,
So as more of a comment, but Bert Evans said that her cousins with ancestral lines to the Masons were residents of Willard.
oh, wow.
Oh,
We really would love,
yes.
if you're willing.
I put your email in the chat.
Thank you.
Okay, good. Thank you. Yes. We've been interviewing people for the last 2 years, about, Willard, St. Louis, and then folks in Fairfax as well. So, we are always happy to make time to sit down. I like to call them conversations rather than interviews.
So your students have been doing a lot of research. I didn't get a full sense of how involved they were in the design process for the model.
Yeah, that's a good question. So in the design process, most of the students weren't a direct part of that, other than our graduate students. So Tony Gadone, who I mentioned earlier, who did the thing on the Richard Chichester Mason and Mississippi. He was instrumental in like just helping us with getting the names of all the enslaved people that we could find. And he was part of all those conversations.
I think Undergrads.
The undergrads
I
were
think
part of the
some of the
initial,
early conversations they were part of, but you
but
know.
they graduated.
Exactly. They come and go. One of them just got married, right? So because of the length of the process, although short, for many of them, they were juniors and seniors.
Yeah,
So they were soon, off and to their adulting.
but they have come back and
They have.
and two of them came for the dedication.
Mhm.
And we do try to keep in touch with them.
Mhm.
I would say that the bulk of our work with students, it started with this one research project, and we spent a lot of time describing the memorial because it's core to our philosophy. But we're doing lots of work looking at how African-American families lost their homes and property in the Northern Virginia area, especially as the suburban area just blew up in the post-World War II. So sometimes people who had property for nearly 100 years following the Civil War were forced out for different things, including sanitation codes and other kinds of
Eminent
issues.
domain,
Eminent domain. And
condemnation.
so our students are involved in all of that, and they are producing stuff on the web
Mhm.
for people to see
And we've got a project this summer with Balch,
with Balch.
and
Yeah.
they will be producing several what we call Omeka sites that will offer a kind of a robust account of Willard, St. Louis, and Mount Pleasant.
Mount Pleasant.
We have, what is effective historical praxis?
So affect is emotion. So affective, anything you're doing affectively, you're doing it with kind of intentional emotion. You're bringing care. And then historical, we're a historian, so we do research. And praxis is both the method plus action.
Right.
So when we're thinking about affective historical praxis, the short, simpler version is critical care.
Yeah, so we really go back to some of these core theoretical texts that help us form a methodology.
Mhm.
And then we combine that by integrating
Research.
that with the actual research and the primary sources.
Yep.
And then I have a question.
Yeah.
So when you're looking at these, like, especially now that you're getting into the 20th century and displaced Black communities,
Yeah.
are you looking at the impact of the tech community here in Northern Virginia?
We haven't gotten that far
That's a
yet,
great question.
but that would be, yeah.
That's really important with all the data centers.
Yeah.
I mean, they're going up everywhere.
Yeah.
I live in Stafford County. They're building one
We
there.
got data.
I mean, you got, you've been
Yeah.
dealing with it forever.
So we haven't had any students do research on that as of yet.
But in a way, it's all
it's
around. I mean,
connected.
the whole place is built on this, and including a myth about the idea of progress,
Mhm.
right? And the progress is
Includes
built around
disruption.
the idea of we need to support the military infrastructure, the government infrastructure. And that's where all these tech companies kind of emerged, right, in the 90s. And they actually emerged even before that in some ways, right?
Yeah.
So how long has Northrop Grumman been around here? So in some ways, the technology displacement's been going on probably, there's a really good book called Covert Capital, which
Amazing.
is really useful, that explains how this process occurred, and it focuses on Northern Virginia.
Yeah, it focuses on the Dulles corridor and thinking about when Reagan National was built.
Yeah.
Like 40s, 50s, and then thinking about the Pentagon when that was built, then you think about Dulles, and then the Capitol Beltway, like that's all happening late 40s, early 50s into the mid 60s. Right. So this incredible infrastructure is created, and what is erased right?
Right. Who's the infrastructure for?
Who's it for and what's erased? The Washington, the Reagan Airport also displaced an African-American
Same
community.
with,
And same with the Pentagon.
right? So these are reproduced stories over and over.
Yep.
And that's, and what we're seeing is they have a long legacy that go back as early as the 20s, believe it or not,
Mhm.
where there's this really, purposeful movement called the Better Homes Movement, Better Homes,
Homes of
Association.
America. Mhm.
And that movement was all about identifying the ideal place to live as a single family home. Which was different than what you would have in most places where you had kind of apartment living and the idea is to escape the urban centers, right? To have these single family homes. And this was a collaborative means with the federal government and home builders and
And
Girl
residents.
Scouts and, you know, name your cultural groups. They were all part of this Better Homes movement. Pardon me. And that then leads us down a certain path of what is the purpose
Mhm.
of growth, right?
Right.
And progress. And
Mhm.
how does that look?
Yeah, and one of the things we've been finding in Fairfax and a bit in Loudoun, although it hasn't been our focus, is if you prioritize single family homes and their zoning rules, what are the consequences of that, right? And we think about now, we say, oh my gosh, nobody can afford a home. It's all so expensive. Well, how did we get here?
Right? There were how did we get here?
How did we have-
Housing shortages right after World War I. Right?
Mhm.
So how did we deal with that? They came up with this model. They
Right.
made choices.
Yeah.
The choices aren't neutral,
Choices aren't neutral.
right?
Yep.
They were
Choices made.
deliberate choices.
Yep.
And they produced what they intended to produce, high value homes
And housing shortages.
and housing shortages.
Yeah, so it's,
And I live in one of these homes, right?
Yeah.
I mean.
Yes.
it's-
we imitate ourselves all the time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it's
Yeah.
just, we're all part of this.
Yeah, but this is the work that we do with our students. Again, work that's impactful, work that can open up new ways of thinking about the past and the past relationship with the present.
Thank you.
Oh, one more question.
What year was that?
This one that we followed was in the 30s.
I've heard of it now, so I was.
Yeah.
I want to make sure that was the right one.
And so there were a bunch of ones, they were all in that same cluster. And you know where we got the list from, just to kind of be transparent? We found an easy list created by the James Madison University folks. And they did a nice job of like identifying the key events, and they built that off of some other person's work. I forget who. But then what we did is we showed, okay, don't just use the newspapers these people found, right?
Go deeper.
Because that was only a small fraction of what was available. And so we showed them how you can kind of find more stuff.
Yeah.
And we did this, so just to be clear, the lost and found, we had 10 of them. We had one on oral histories, we had one on newspapers.
Yep.
One on
Different
maps.
types of sources
Different
that we
types of
help
sources.
students read critically.
Right,
Yep.
right. Different kinds of government documents, so.
Yeah.
Hopefully that makes sense.
Yep. All right.
Sorry.
It's okay. Thank you guys so much.
Thanks, y'all, and thank you for the question.
They were great.
So enjoyed them.
Hopefully.
Yeah.
There's more questions.
Yep.
Yeah.
Alicia asked, will you make presentations for other groups?
Sure.
Reach out to us.
Yeah.
We have a busy schedule, but we'll work with you.
Great.
We had to do
Thank you so much.
it.
Welcome. I hope it was illuminating.